Though I have arrived here in Adelaide from Peking, as a matter of fact, I am extremely grateful to Professor Giusi and to the whole organizational team, including, first of all, Melinda Jewell, because they gave me this opportunity to come from what is an island, Sicily, to this other island. And, there are so many resonances in that it's really, for me, a kind of, in this moment I'm here, but as a matter of fact, I'm in a kind of dream somehow. So I have prepared these 7 minutes according to some kind of requests that have gone through the internet with Professor Giusi. But if I'm allowed, if I can borrow one slide from Annie Ren, I would like to maybe reply to your question about what is lost in translation. That is one of the things that are really making me very, 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 into this kind of topic. But I will be a little bit more general than what has been done so far, because I'll try to give a kind of reading of what's today in China, in fact, concerning this world literature in a way. And I want to start by saying that we are in a time of commodification, where everything has got a price, everything can be sold and bought, and we also use art as an object of consumption. I mean, we consume art, we consume films, theater, books. We just keep on buying and selling and all that stuff. In this kind of context, the means offered by the technology, the IT technology, are even, stressing these potentialities which are in this kind of era. And especially in connection to China, when China is trying to disseminate her culture in the world. We have been speaking this morning about soft powers and, this kind of topic, which is a kind of very, very multifaceted topic at the moment. Now, if we observe this situation from what I call the external point of view, external to China, then we bring in the world of translation these hermeneutics of dealing with the other, what is different from us, a reason for which we do translate, because it's not like what we know. And in this kind of approach, I believe that there still is this very romantic, from European tradition romanticism, view about getting to know the other. So we do need to translate. But in this era of commodification, this need to know is also bound to the idea of the bestseller. I translate what I think is going to sell very much, if not as a translator, at least as a publishing house. A publishing house needs to have a kind of return on the work that they do. And therefore, in the West so far, the approach to translation is rather sparse, if I can say so. I can be a translator, I can like something and I do translate it, then perhaps I'm lucky enough to find somebody who can publish it. If it sells well, maybe I'm asked to translate something else by the same author or poet. If it doesn't work, doesn't matter. But then I never get through this translation a kind of consequent overlook of what is being produced in China, for instance, when China is the case for us. On the other hand, so we work on quantity, we use the language, of course we have to base ourselves on that language, in this case Chinese. When we move to the other side and we go into China, at the moment, if we do compare this time to the 80s, that have been another time of enormous blossoming and flourishing of all possible cultural activities, including narrative and poetry. In China, the audience nowadays in China is something that I could say is more mature, is more selective. The audience wants something more than just, what is being, happening or whatever. And the authors, the writers, the literary world looks for connections, search for connections and try to develop this connection. And in this picture also enters the idea that by being a well-known writer or poet, I reach a kind of a status of fame, so to say, that is also linked to the fact that I can get money out of that, very plainly putting it, right? So it's very important to obtain prizes. We have a very big presence of Chinese writers all over the world in connection to prizes, which are given to Chinese writers or Chinese artists or poets. And to this is also connected the recognition of this author, that by having received prizes abroad is also recognized in his own country. So it places this already on a different level if compared to the others. And the Chinese government is absolutely aware of this and makes a clear use of this knowledge by attempting this dissemination of the Chinese culture or the Chinese values through the dissemination of the Confucius Institutes, for instance. You know that there is a very, not now anymore, because even in China the funding is becoming a little bit more under control now, but until a few years ago, the aim of the founding of the Confucius Institute was a very, very strong one by the Chinese government. And so Confucius comes back into the picture. So it's always this moment when, and Confucius has been, during the Cultural Revolution, the object of very harsh criticism, together with Lin Biao. Pilin, Picung was the campaign. So it always depends, like this morning we have seen with Lu Xun. Now, the work of translation in my country, for instance, has been seeing kind of epochs again. If we don't want to go that far as Marco Polo writings about China that gave the world an idea of the existence of China, we also have been having this missionaries work through the translation of Jesuits, most of all, because we also had Dominicans, we also had Franciscans coming to China, but those who were immediately aware of the need of knowing the Chinese culture and the Chinese language came out from the Jesuits. So their translations were a second step towards the knowledge of this world. So from a time in which Marco Polo needed new markets, so moved to China or towards the east in search of an economical return, with the missionaries we have an approach which is more cultural to the world of translation. I need translation to know, I need to translate. And in more recent times, during the 70s, for instance, the translation work being done in Italy was done mostly by scholars who were most of the time professors at the universities and who were bound to the Chinese world because of political reasons. Many of them were members of the Italian Communist Party, or even they were members of further leftist wing parties in Italy. Nowadays, the approach is a little bit different. Nowadays, the work that we do is more according to contemporary theories about translations that see most of the times the translator engaged on the original language. We don't translate anymore through English or through French translation. We do translate directly from Chinese, which is one of the requirements nowadays, right, from theory. And so we cannot say that we do have professional translators of Chinese literature, but mostly scholars who keep doing also the work of translation for needs of research or whatever, and it also comes into the picture. But these are also the works that are being sold on the market, in fact. So the approach remains quite sparse nowadays, but it has this idea of working on the original language above all. And the same kind of situation, in my opinion, applies to China as well. When Chinese translate from foreign languages nowadays, Whereas some years ago, it could also go through, for instance, texts written in Japanese because it was closer to that. Now they just go directly from the original language to the Chinese language. But here too, the approach comes from scholars who are translators, but because these scholars are engaged in the translation of more than one work by the same author, in a way, they underline the professional component to this kind of work. Another thing that is very, very peculiar of China today is that, peculiar, I mean, it was also like this at the beginning of last century, so to say, but nowadays it's very, very strong, and it is the wish on the Chinese side to know what the foreigners think about China. The reason why at the moment I'm in Peking, teaching at a university in town, is that the Chinese people there want to know how do we deal with the Chinese poetry, in my case in particular. So this is a kind of opening of China towards the world that I'm sure it's finalized to use this acquired knowledge for other things that they have in mind to do. Okay, I don't know exactly what, but okay, this is what I think. There is also to place then the Chinese literature in the world context. For what concerns Italy, for instance, we have had one woman writer. The name is Hurst. She has been living in Milan, and she has been writing quite a few books about her experience in going back to Shanghai, where she was born. And she wrote things like, I go to Shanghai to buy a hat, Daughters of China. I mean, these are my free translation of the titles, but she wrote them in Italian. Blue China, The Last Dance in the Forbidden City, Postcards from Peking, Passage to Shanghai, The World Beyond the River of the Peach Blooms, and Ink of China. So she has a kind of very, very intense production between the end of the 80s and, a couple of years ago. So these are writers who, like in many cases, when they live abroad, they still write about what they remember of their own country, how do they deal with the new reality, and this placement of the Chinese culture in a new context. In Palermo, we have a community of Chinese people that is there already for 30 years. They are engaged in work, but they have many shops, but they are not producing written material yet. So maybe it takes quite a long time before this can happen. And we are also having this student exchange. And I suppose that this will produce something, but we are still on an early stage. So this is a little bit the picture I would like to give in connection to translation and today's China. But if I may go back to that, I would like to show, I was not prepared to come into the details of the kind of work that I do, but because the question of Annie Ren was the one, this one, thank you. She has been posing a question about what is lost in translation. I think that what Pound and Ernest Fenollosa did in connecting with the Chinese language was the fact that they've been putting into the foreground these things, right? And Fenollosa in particular speaks about this character, that is the jian, to look, where we see an eye. Why this is an eye? Because if you write it in the pictographic style, you will have the eye with the pupil inside. The pupil becomes two straight lines, and the eye from curved lines become a square. And this eye has got 2 feet. Therefore, the eye walks while looking around. So it's something in this idea. So what Pound and Fenollosa tried to do was just to put this in the foreground. And this is the biggest loss we have when translating from Chinese into Italian, for instance. What we don't see anymore when we do translate towards these things into this way is what we see here. This is a river. The river gets back here and here. And we have the moon. The moon is here and here and here again. We have he, ren, he, nian. Which person, which year. We have a double term here and a double term here. The generation, the year, and the year. We have sounds here like yue, ren, i, f that create a kind of rhyme in a way. It's a special rhyme, but it is a rhyme. So, and we have chu, the beginning of something which is repeated here. We have a negation here. So, what we lose immediately in the translation, the biggest loss that we have in translating from Chinese is just this visual impact. I don't need to know how I have to read these characters to know what is written here. It is enough that I look at this, just at these drawings there, and I have a perception of what is written inside. So in this poem, the river is an important question. And also the moon is a very important question. As well as the man that comes back at least 2 times. Okay? So is this is something that we have to keep in mind when we translate from Chinese into another language, written with letters. And I don't know. Nowadays we all speak about recreation or transliteration when we speak about the newest translation techniques and theories. So perhaps to do this, we will need a transcreation. In which terms, I'm not able to say yet, but in my opinion, this is a very open question. And with this, I thank you all.